Joining me now on the set, CBS 2 political reporter Marcia Kramer here. A lot of different things to talk about. Not only the history here, there are political implications, and we could say anything. Just the last thing I want to start with that Alice was just talking about, the president, former president, comes here, you know, the fingerprinting, the mug shot, the perp walk, the handcuffs, because he is who he is and would be with Secret Service. Well, everything's different, right?
Well, I can tell you, Dana, that there's been a lot of meetings on the part of court officers, the district attorney's office, the Secret Service, and the NYPD discussing just how you're going to handle a former president who's been indicted. And the one thing they want to avoid is a circus. Of course, some people think it's going to be a circus anyway, and that maybe Mr. Trump would want it to be high profile because he's, you know, very upset about this. But the truth of the matter is they're going to try to handle it as dignified a way as possible. They're going to try to have him, I'm told, that he can enter the courtroom from a sally port from behind the courthouse, and that goes right into the arraignment section, so they can avoid that. The other thing that I was hearing is the possibility that they might want to bring him in on a Sunday, which is something that they're concerned about because then there's less people in the city. And there's a concern that the NYPD has expressed about the possibility that you could have his supporters try to have a peaceful demonstration by blocking traffic, that they would want to block bridges and tunnels and the traffic in lower Manhattan. And that's a kind of a protest where you don't get arrested for going 5 miles an hour. So they're thinking about the possibility of doing it on a day when there's not a lot of people in lower Manhattan so that you can minimize whatever effects that the protesters might decide to do.
Let's talk about the grand jury process. Now, we know DA Bragg, this started years ago before him, and the grand jury process, they meet secretly. We don't know who they are. 23 people. You have to have a majority. 12, and it's not the same as you know, probable cause. It's so that the DA can go ahead and charge and take it to a trial. Can you talk about that a little bit? And so much of Alvin Bragg just
so the thing that a lot of court observers have pointed out, and I think this is sort of interesting, is the fact that Alvin Bragg decided to bring this case. Remember, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District passed on the same case. Yeah. The Federal Election Commission passed on the same case. Cy Vance, the former DA, before he left office, passed on the case. When Alvin Bragg took office, he stopped the grand jury that was investigating this. Now he's decided to do it. Now, you may ask yourself, why now? Now, some people, some political observers think that this might help Alvin Bragg in terms of his supporters who haven't been thrilled with his decision to on bail and letting people walk the streets after they've committed crimes. So those same people who are not supporters of Trump would be happy that he would be indicting somebody now, so that may help him in his re-election campaign and with his supporters. But the people that I talk to also say that Alvin Bragg is a very smart prosecutor, and they don't think that he would bring a case like this, a high-profile case like this, unless he thought he could make it stick. So obviously, the attorneys that are hired by the former president are going to try to defeat the case any way they can. But, you know, I think that Alvin Bragg must think he has a pretty serious case if he would, you know, bring the indictment after this whole level of people from the Southern District to the feds and everybody else decided not to bring the case.
Your history here in New York City, Marcia, years, decades, you've covered Donald Trump through his different lives.
I have.
I said lives with an L. And just, you know, looking at that from your perspective as a former president now indicted, making history infamously.
Well, see, the thing that's interesting about Donald Trump, and I have covered him for many, many decades, is how many bullets he's actually dodged in his whole professional life here in New York. You forget that he went into bankruptcy by all the casinos and things that he built in Atlantic City and had to give them up. He had an airline, Trump Airline, that used to fly shuttle to Washington and back and Boston and back. That went under. And he's also survived numerous suits by contractors who he tried to reduce the amount of money he would pay them, and they sued him to get their money. And also, there have been problems with some of the places that he's built. For example, what I'm told by people who know him is that the Riverside project along the west side, originally the concrete was too thin, too soft. They had to re-pour the floors because they had inferior concrete. So and the other thing that I would point out, he's also survived the indictment of his top financial person,
right,
Alan Weisselberg, and Weisselberg, who, they tried very hard to get to turn state's evidence and to testify against Mr. Trump, and they weren't able to do that, as far as we know. But that's a really hanging Chad question. Has Weisselberg given the DA some information in this case that can shed light on the fact that Mr. Trump authorized the payments, if that's exactly the case, if it involves the payments that were made to the adult porn star, if he gave them any information on or off the record?
When DA Bragg, they asked Mr. Trump or his team if he wanted to go before this grand jury, and then later on he said no, and Robert Costello,
right,
who works with Michael Cohen,
right,
and just completely slashed the reputation of Cohen. Just talk about that procedure.
Well, if you talk to any former prosecutor, they will tell you that Michael Cohen is an unappealing witness. That doesn't mean he's lying. He's just unappealing because he went to jail for the charges that are alleged to be in this indictment. So obviously the defense attorneys are going to try to rock him and rock his testimony. But I have to think that if they are putting their case on Michael Cohen, that he must have given them information that made the grand jury believe that there were charges that should be brought.
We're looking at District Attorney Bragg of the County of New York, this state case. You said something about him. What did you say? That he's done a good job. He wouldn't go.
Well, he has a history.
He's had a lot of criticism, too.
Well, he's had a criticism of his bail views and the fact that he thinks that people should be released on bail and not be held on small amounts of bail if they can't make it. But the thing is, remember, he came from Attorney General Tish James's office, and he had experience actually in that office making cases against Donald Trump. So he does have an experience with this man, and he also has brought some pretty tough cases. And his reputation before he ran for district attorney was of a really first-class prosecutor and somebody who knows his stuff.
And we know just the other day, Espaillat and other leaders in his in Harlem, where he's from, right, D.A. Bragg, and just really standing up for him, supporting him, and like, don't go after him. He's doing the job. He is following the rule of law.
See, this is sort of politics 101. What happened during the governor's race was that the Republicans tried to paint Bragg as soft on crime and link him to Kathy Hochul. So he's dealing with the result of that campaign as well, that they tried to impugn his integrity and his ability as a prosecutor. But that was politics. It wasn't reality. And so now he's going to have to strut his stuff and show, I know what I'm doing. I'm a prosecutor, and I presented a case to the grand jury that I think I can win. That remains to be seen.
That remains to be seen. The whole timetable remains to be seen, as you said at the beginning.
There's another thing that you have to talk about, and that is, can Mr. Trump get a fair trial in Manhattan, given all the pretrial publicity? And while one would argue that he's known every place in the country and every place in the state, and so everybody knows about him in this case, the truth of the matter is that the defense attorneys will probably come in and make a motion to move the jurisdiction, to move it to some friendlier place, a Republican area of the state, thinking that he could get a fairer jury. I don't know whether a judge will agree to that, but that's certainly something they'll try to do.
Marcia Kramer, we should also say indicted, still innocent until proven guilty. There is a process here.
It is a process.
Thank you. So much more to talk about, and I'm sure we will over the next hours and days.